Okay, picture this. You've got a group of brilliant, highly educated people, right? Now imagine those exact same folks coming together and suddenly acting collectively like absolute fools. Totally irrational, impulsive behavior. Sounds practically impossible, doesn't it? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We're unpacking Gustave Le Bon's massive 1895 text, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. It basically serves as a manual for this deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon. Le Bon's big argument? When individuals form a crowd, their conscious personality literally vanishes.
To keep us from getting totally overwhelmed by this dense theory, we're going to slice the mind of the crowd into 5 specific parts. 1. Welcome to the crowd era. 2. Enter the psychological crowd. 3. Extremes of emotion and morality. 4. Images replace rational thought. And 5. The religion of the masses.
All right, part 1. Welcome to the crowd era, the dawn of the masses.
So, Le Bon kicks things off by asserting that humanity is living through a critical transition period. The old pillars of society, stuff like the conscious activity of kings, traditional politics, individual leaders, they're all crumbling. And what's taking their place? The unconscious action of crowds. He defines this era of crowds as a time where the voice of the masses holds this preponderant, almost divine right. Now, the source text views this massive power shift with deep, deep alarm. Le Bon argues crowds are really only powerful for destruction. Actually, he goes as far as to say their rule represents a potential return to a barbarian phase, comparing them to microbes that just hasten the dissolution of an already sick, enfeebled civilization.
Which brings us to part 2. Enter the psychological crowd, the magic trick of transformation.
So, how exactly does a totally random, accidental gathering of people suddenly transform into a unified, singular psychological entity? Well, we need to clear up a major misconception right off the bat. A psychological crowd isn't just about numbers, it's entirely a state of mind. You could have 1,000 people gathered by accident in a public square who do not form a crowd. On the flip side, you could have thousands of physically separated individuals who, while reacting to a major national event, suddenly become a single collective being. It happens the exact second conscious personality vanishes and all their sentiments take a single identical direction, governed entirely by unconscious forces.
So how does an individual get stripped of their conscious personality? The source outlines 3 very specific steps. Step 1 is Invincible Power. Basically, the sheer number of people provides anonymity, and that instantly destroys any sense of personal responsibility or restraint. Step 2 is Contagion. Every single sentiment and act becomes highly contagious, causing individuals to suddenly sacrifice their personal interests for the collective. And Step 3 is Suggestibility. Le Bon actually compares this to being mesmerized by a hypnotist. The brain's activity is completely paralyzed, and this unconscious, automaton-like state just takes over. And this leads to what is probably Le Bon's most provocative claim. He writes, "Moreover, by the mere fact that he forms part of an organized crowd, a man descends several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Entering a crowd essentially overrides a person's education, their background, their logic. A normally enlightened, peaceful citizen becomes a primitive being, driven purely by violent, spontaneous instincts." Moving on to part 3, Extremes of Emotion and Morality, a brain replaced by a spinal cord. Once that conscious mind goes dark, the crowd's behavior completely shifts. Instead of being guided by the complex, calculating brain, they are at the total, automatic mercy of spinal cord reflexes. The contrast here is just stark. An isolated individual calculates self-interest, acts consciously, and restrains their basic instincts to remain moderate, right? But a crowd member? They're unconscious, a total slave to external impulses, dealing only in extreme exaggeration. Because they lack restraint, the text notes crowds are capable of the darkest, most cowardly murders. But interestingly, they are equally capable of the most heroic, selfless sacrifices, acting entirely without thought for their own survival.
I want to pause right here and ask you a question. So if crowds are driven purely by this volatile, extreme emotion, how do they actually reason? How does a group completely devoid of conscious thought process information or logic or truth?
Let's look at part 4 to find out. Images replace rational thought, the hallucinating masses.
According to Le Bon, crowds are entirely incapable of logical reasoning, period. Instead, they process information exclusively through highly theatrical, disconnected imagery. To illustrate this, the source shares this incredible historical anecdote. Cruising in broad daylight, the watch of the French frigate Belle-Poule signaled a disabled vessel. Suddenly, through contagious suggestion, the entire crew, from the lowest-ranking sailors all the way up to the highly educated officers, clearly perceived a raft of shipwrecked men waving frantically for rescue. They all heard the distressed voices. They literally all saw the exact same thing.
But here is the wild twist of this mass hallucination. When the rescue boat actually reached the object, the illusion vanished. They found themselves solely in the presence of a few branches of trees that had swept out from the coast. For Le Bon, this perfectly demonstrates that crowds absolutely cannot distinguish the subjective from the objective. A crowd replaces reality with illusions, and thanks to Contagion, even the absolute smartest individuals buy into the hallucination.
This establishes a really foundational rule. A crowd thinks in images. If you want to influence a mass of people, complex logic is completely useless. You have to present them with a startling, crystal-clear image. Maybe a great victory, a terrible crime, a miracle, stripped of all nuance and accessory explanations. Because the crowd has no critical spirit, the image instantly bypasses their defenses and becomes their absolute reality.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the religion of the masses, the demand for a god.
So if logic is out the window and images rule, what does the crowd actually believe? Le Bon establishes that all crowd convictions inevitably take on a highly religious shape, culminating in the demand for a god. The mechanics of this belief are pretty severe. We're talking the worship of a superior being, fear of its power, blind submission, a total inability to discuss dogmas, and fierce intolerance of enemies. And Le Bon neutrally points out that this absolute fanatical devotion isn't just about traditional deities. This exact same religious sentiment applies perfectly to political ideas or historical figures like the Jacobins or Napoleon. The second a crowd adopts a political ideology, it becomes a religion.
Once more, the contrast is staggering. Think about an isolated individual. They can accept contradiction, hold independent opinions, and tolerate debate. A crowd, though, fiercely intolerant. It instantly demands blind obedience, an authoritarian ruler, and cruelly crushes any contradiction with violent invective. To a crowd, kindness is seen as weakness. They only respect and bow down to an iron hand.
The timeline of the French Revolution brilliantly illustrates this extreme emotional mobility. Look at 1789. Acting as a heroic crowd, nobles enthusiastically renounced their privileges in a single night, something they would never do individually. Fast forward to 1793, and the crowd's sentiment swung to the bloody, savage excesses of the Reign of Terror. And finally, by the 1800s, completely exhausted by disorder, those very same crowds willingly shifted to worshiping the dictatorial iron hand of Napoleon. They moved from pure generosity to absolute terror to total servility. Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. We've seen how anonymity, contagion, and suggestibility strip away reason. We've seen how intelligence and education offer zero protection against the mass hallucinations and primitive instincts of the psychological crowd. So my question to you is this: if a crowd functions as a single, suggestible mind, are you ever truly immune to its psychological override? Understanding these dynamics is absolutely crucial, because according to Le Bon, when the crowd takes over, no one is naturally safe from becoming an unconscious automaton. Definitely something to think about next time you find yourself swept up in a group. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.